Bienvenue à cette réunion virtuelle OCDE. Merci de bien vouloir utiliser un casque USB filaire doté d'un micro. Le Bluetooth est déconseillé car cela peut nuire à la qualité de votre son. Lorsque vous n'intervenez pas, merci de bien vouloir désactiver votre micro en appuyant sur le bouton Mute situé en bas à gauche de l'application Zoom. Si votre micro n'est pas désactivé, cela risque de créer un écho ou du larsen pour les autres participants. Pour les réunions avec interprétation. Si vous écoutez un canal d'interprétation et que vous souhaitez prendre la parole, merci de bien vouloir sélectionner Off dans la fonction Interprétation de Zoom avant de vous exprimer. Une fois que votre intervention est terminée, vous pourrez à nouveau sélectionner le canal d'interprétation. Si vous avez un texte pour votre discours, merci de bien vouloir l'envoyer à l'adresse suivante: document.interprète@oecd.org. Si vous rencontrez des difficultés techniques, vous pouvez utiliser la fonction chat de Zoom afin de contacter le host ou co-host de la réunion ou bien envoyer un mail à l'adresse suivante: conférence.support@oecd.org. Merci de votre attention et de votre coopération.
Welcome to this OECD virtual meeting. Make sure you use a tethered USB headset with a microphone. Please avoid using Bluetooth devices as they may impair your sound quality. Unless you are taking the floor to intervene, please make sure you press the mute button, which is located in the lower left corner of the Zoom application. Failing to do so may cause echo or feedback for other participants. For meetings where there is interpretation, if you are listening to an interpretation channel and you wish to take the floor, it is essential to select Off on the Zoom interpreting function before doing so. Once you are finished, you can switch back to the interpretation channel. Should you have a prepared text of your speech or any written notes, please send it to the following address: documents.interprete@oecd.org. Should you encounter technical difficulties, you may use the Zoom chat function to contact the meeting host or co-host, or send an email to the following address: conference.support@oecd.org. Thank you for your attention and cooperation.
Can we start? Luis?
Yes, we start. Sorry.
Okay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Bonjour, monsieur et madame. Welcome to our meeting of the joint initiative between the African Union Commission and the OECD Development Center on investment and productive transformation. As some of you know, we have structured this platform around 3 building blocks: human capital development. We had an excellent discussion yesterday. Global value chain and regional value chain under the opportunity that represents the African Continental Free Trade Area that we will organize before the summer. And the meeting that we have today, infrastructure and connectivity. I would like esteemed panelists to recall you a few technical items that we already are familiar with, but we need to emphasize. La réunion sera enregistrée. L'interprétation est disponible en français et en anglais. Et l'audience sera invitée à envoyer des questions dans la fonction questions-réponses du Zoom de la session. Les modérateurs reviendront pendant la séance, dédiée aux questions-réponses. Merci beaucoup. Et maintenant, je vais passer la parole à Mario Pessini qui va faire des remarques d'introduction. Mario est le directeur du Centre de développement de l'OCDE et le conseiller spécial du secrétaire général pour le développement. Mario, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luis. Welcome. Welcome to the participants for this inaugural meeting on investing in infrastructure connectivity, which is under the platform on investment and productive transformation. You have heard of the meeting of the day before yesterday, the Africa Forum, and yesterday, the first meeting of the platform. Why are we concentrating on investment in infrastructure? Because they will play a critical role in supporting the economic recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. And why that's the case? Well, because this investment provide economic multiplier effect through sustained job creation, long-term productivity, and demand. Therefore, strengthening connectivity will moreover be crucial over the next years for realizing the opportunity that are created by the Free Trade Agreement of Africa, which is a very good news. And let me recall that if Africa had an average growth between 2000 and 2018 of 4.6% a year in average, as I said, well, 69% of this growth came from internal demand. Therefore, the free trade area is, without any doubt, a passport for further growth and we hope development. And this will be a condition also for the so needed productive transformation. Now, one of the new elements of the next phase, 21-30, of the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, what we call the PIDA, is its nature of integrated and multi-sectoral process that provide multi-sectoral and integrated objective. These highlight the importance of a more holistic and systemic approach to infrastructure connectivity. For the next decade of regional infrastructure projects in Africa should not just aim to increase the stock of the physical infrastructure, but rather to generate comprehensive and efficient connectivity that will create an enabling environment for productive investment. Now, let me emphasize once more, this integrated approach is an opportunity, not just to address the hard elements of the physical infrastructure, but also the soft dimension of infrastructure. Over the past 10 years, a growing body of research has demonstrated the important role of this soft factor of infrastructure. They play an important role in determining overall performance and economic value of the physical infrastructure. This called for a change of paradigm, conceiving infrastructure not just in terms of the stock of physical asset, but in terms of the efficiency and effectiveness of service delivery. An integrated approach should also ensure that the continental connectivity is resilient, is robust, and sustainable, both socially and environmentally, and will also ensure economic efficiency over the entire life cycle and transparent governance. So we need high standards of quality infrastructure. This investment needs to be quality investment, as it is outlined in the PIDA quality label that the OECD Development Center is supporting, and in the G20 principle for quality infrastructure investment. Actually, we are supporting Nepad, we are supporting the Africa Union, which is the structure we are serving, and we are not alone in doing it because ASSET has been a very good partner in all the work that we have been doing, and we will continue to do with this very important institution. Now, let me give you a quick overview of the session. If this is the background, this meeting aims to shed light on both the hard and the soft infrastructure elements that are interdependent, as I just said, and need to be better synchronized to ensure that the investment infrastructure are efficient and lead to improvements in continental connectivity performance. So we will have a first panel that will cover investment in physical infrastructure, addressing challenges related to risk mitigation, project preparation, and investment strategies. The infrastructure gap in Africa, we know, is estimated in 130, 170 billion per year, while 80% of infrastructure projects fail at the feasibility and planning stage. It's not the only continent in which this is happening. As the center work on Latin America and Southeast Asia, unfortunately, this is very often a common trait. Nevertheless, we need to address this element for the sake of growth and development. The second panel we will have will address the soft infrastructure of it. While there is much more consensus on how to develop the physical infrastructure, the regulation of services and other soft elements has proven to be less straightforward and yet equally important. This discussion will draw on the experience of other regions, as I said, Europe, Asia, Latin America, experiencing mainstreaming soft infrastructure into infrastructure strategies and projects. So let me now introduce Jean-Denis Gabichini, which will be the moderator and the animator in the next session. Jean-Denis is acting director in the Department of Economic Affairs of the African Union Commission. And thanks, Jean-Denis, for the moderation of the meeting. Thank you. Have a nice day of work. Thank you.
Oui, merci Mario. J'espère que vous m'entendez parce qu'il y a eu un petit problème technique de mon côté.
Oui, oui, on t'entend très bien.
Voilà, j'étais obligé d'utiliser une autre plateforme au lieu d'utiliser mon laptop. Donc, très rapidement, je vais donc juste faire un petit rappel des règles de notre session, juste pour indiquer que cette session va donc, comme on l'a déjà vu, c'est enregistré. Les microphones donc, vont être coupés pour éviter effectivement qu'il y ait des bruits de fond. L'interprétation français-anglais disponible, donc c'est juste choisir la langue préférée, juste l'écran, le icon qui est juste en bas. Et également pour ceux qui voudraient donc poser des questions, s'assurer d'indiquer les questions via le chat. Comme ça, on va les soumettre à la segment de questions-réponses. Juste un petit rappel en fait, à cette session, juste pour dire qu'en fait, au cours des deux derniers jours, nous avons suivi avec beaucoup d'intérêt les échanges qui ont, entre autres, porté donc, sur les infrastructures, comme vient de le rappeler Mario. Et pendant ces échanges, nous avons appris trois choses essentielles. Premièrement, l'importance donc d'accroître les investissements pour combler le déficit d'infrastructures et générer la croissance durable sur le continent. Deuxième point, le défi en termes de mobilisation de ressources, tant publiques qu'internes pour les infrastructures. Et troisième élément que l'on a appris, c'est le défi en termes de capacité technique pour préparer les projets bancables, comme le disait le docteur Mayaki. Alors, par ailleurs, nous avons également, à ce défi s'ajoute la détérioration donc, de la situation budgétaire des gouvernements africains qui menace donc les dépenses d'infrastructures, une situation qui augmente la pression sur les gouvernements africains pour prendre des initiatives visant à augmenter les investissements privés, locaux et étrangers. Alors, donc, je vais très rapidement, je voulais juste rappeler cela, comme Mario l'a déjà indiqué, ce panel est donc censé discuter des nouvelles approches et instruments qui voudront donc promouvoir la participation du secteur privé dans les infrastructures, y compris des approches visant à atténuer la perception du risque, hein, comme le disait le président Macky Sall au début, et ainsi qu'améliorer la préparation des projets, comme je le disais tantôt. Alors, les questions, Mario les a déjà indiquées. Nous allons donc répondre à trois questions essentielles pour ce panel. D'abord, qu'avons-nous appris sur la mobilisation des investissements pour les projets régionaux de connectivité, y compris par les biais des partenariats publics-privés? Deuxième question, comment tirer parti des capitaux étrangers et africains pour financer la connectivité des infrastructures? Et dernière question, comment mener à terme la préparation des projets? Alors, donc, pour répondre à ces questions, comme l'a indiqué Mario, je vais donc introduire nos panélistes. D'abord, Monsieur Amin Idriss Adoum, qui est le directeur de la gestion de la coordination des programmes à l'agence du ODA Nepad. Nous aurons également Mr. Peter Vandel, qui est le chef de la direction du Nepad Business Foundation, et également Mr. Ed Brown, qui est le directeur principal de l'African Center for Economic Transformation. Nous aurons également Madame Louise Kanyonga, qui est responsable de la stratégie et de la conformité au Rwanda Development Board. Et enfin, nous devrions avoir également son Excellence, Monsieur Cheikh Kanté, qui n'est pas disponible pour prendre part à cette session. Alors, très rapidement, je vais donc interpeller notre premier panéliste, Monsieur Adoum, juste pour savoir, en s'appuyant sur les expériences de la première phase du PIDA, quels sont, selon vous, Monsieur Adoum, les principaux défis qui empêchent le secteur privé de participer aux projets de connectivité en Afrique?
Merci beaucoup, Jean-Denis. Bonjour à tous les panélistes et bonjour à tous les participants. Donc, moi, je vais parler en français cette fois-ci. Il faut d'abord définir le contexte et le contexte dans lequel nous nous trouvons aujourd'hui. Donc, l'Afrique a un énorme déficit d'infrastructures, vous l'avez dit. La rareté des ressources publiques qui est aussi exacerbée en ce moment par la pandémie du Covid signifie que les investissements du secteur privé sont plus que jamais nécessaires pour combler l'écart de connectivité. Ça veut dire que les États ont d'énormes contraintes budgétaires. Et donc, notre agence, l'ODA Nepad, soutient la participation du secteur privé pour pouvoir aider les pays et puis spécialement leurs projets afin que leurs projets puissent devenir viables et bancables. Nous avons donc créé un mécanisme de prestation de services, en anglais SDM, Service Delivery Mechanism, et puis d'autres instruments pour assurer une meilleure planification des projets prioritaires, les plus cruciaux, mais surtout pouvoir aider les États à mieux gérer le cycle de vie des projets. Alors, quelle est l'approche que nous utilisons? Comme je l'ai mentionné plus haut, le secteur privé et le secteur public doivent créer de façon proactive un écosystème de développement de projets qui puisse être efficace et efficient et qui doit se traduire en fait par une intensification importante des pipelines des projets d'infrastructure. Mais surtout, j'insiste sur ce mot, des projets d'infrastructure bancables. Pour nous, c'est extrêmement important. Alors, grâce donc au PIDA, le continent a identifié ses priorités en matière d'infrastructure pour la décennie 2021-2030. Donc, nous avons défini environ 70 projets dont le CAPEX, c'est-à-dire les investissements, est estimé à environ 161 milliards de dollars. Donc, dans les domaines de l'énergie, d'une part, des transports, de l'eau, des technologies de l'information et de la communication, bien entendu, mais aussi des projets sociaux. Donc, fondamentalement, ces projets visent à la transformation économique structurelle de l'Afrique et puis, bien entendu, à l'amélioration de nos façons de vivre. Donc, alors, quels sont les défis auxquels nous sommes confrontés en ce moment? Pour pouvoir mettre en œuvre le PIDA, nos principaux défis sont au nombre de trois. D'abord, des ressources limitées pour la préparation des projets en amont, c'est extrêmement important, parce que sans une bonne préparation de projet, je pense que le projet, et vous l'avez dit tout à l'heure, le projet il est voué à un échec évident. Deuxièmement, améliorer la perception en fait macroéconomique et la perception des risques politiques pour les investisseurs, donc pas les investisseurs potentiels en Afrique. Donc l'Afrique est considérée comme un continent extrêmement risqué, ce qui n'est pas forcément toujours le cas. Je pense qu'il y a beaucoup d'ignorance, beaucoup de manque d'informations et de connaissances. Donc notre rôle est de combler ce déficit. Et puis troisièmement, il y a une absence criarde d'instruments adéquats et suffisants pour pouvoir atténuer ces risques, les risques qui sont liés aux projets prioritaires. Donc, par le biais du mécanisme africain d'assurance pour de garantie pour les investissements dans les infrastructures, Africa Infrastructure Guarantee Mechanism, nous espérons, au sein de l'ODA-Nepad, engager activement les investisseurs, mais aussi les promoteurs de projets et les développeurs de projets pour pouvoir relever les défis que j'ai mentionnés tout à l'heure. Donc voilà, si vous voulez, pour répondre directement à votre question, ce que nous faisons. Je reviendrai tout à l'heure, bien entendu, sur comment fonctionne le SDM et le PIDA Quality Label, qui sont des instruments, ainsi que le AIGM, qui sont les instruments que nous avons développés. Donc, ça sera pour le deuxième round de questions. Merci beaucoup à Jean-Denis.
Oui, merci M. Adoum pour ces éléments pertinents qui, effectivement, nous donnent l'idée de ce que le Nepad envisage, en fait, a mis en place comme mécanisme pour en fait s'assurer de la confiance que les gens peuvent faire autant sur le plan politique que le plan économique pour faire face aux risques politiques qui est comme une perception négative qui empêche les investisseurs en fait à s'intéresser particulièrement au marché africain. Et nous avons donc pris bonne note et nous allons revenir à cela. Passons donc à Monsieur Peter, de Nepad Business Foundation. La question, c'est comment pensez-vous que les gouvernements peuvent le mieux s'attaquer à la perception, encore une fois de plus, on revient à la question de la perception, comment pensez-vous que les gouvernements peuvent mieux s'attaquer à la perception du risque supposément élevé dans les investissements des infrastructures en Afrique? Quel est votre avis par rapport à cette question? Monsieur Peter, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity and greetings to all on this call, and thank you for involving us. It's great to hear from the ADA Nepad earlier. Just a little bit of background on the Nepad Business Foundation. We principally exist to support the ADA Nepad plans, particularly the PIDA plan in the infrastructure space. And our role has very much been to mobilize private sector in support of government-endorsed initiatives. And mobilizing private sector can mean anything from financial resources to expertise to information, etc. So like I've said earlier, we're really looking to find alignment between what are effectively government-endorsed initiatives and have the political will to succeed with those that align with the interests of business, either projects that business sees as critical to their growth as an infrastructure user, or as projects that they see as good opportunities to participate in the case of the infrastructure practitioners. So we have a number of aligned projects in this space, and typically we seek to support the ADA Nepad, SADC Secretariat, and national governments as it may be. And some examples would be the North-South Corridor Rail project, which is a PIDA project and a SADC regional infrastructure master plan project. We're also supporting SADC with regional gas master planning from an infrastructure perspective. And at a South Africa level, a nice example is the support to the Department of Water and the National Water Plan. So all areas of high interest to businesses where we're able to support the execution. In terms of the perception of high risk, I don't think I'll be able to share anything specifically new that hasn't been discussed before, but just maybe to reiterate it. I think first of all, governments need to be realistic about the potential of their projects for investment, and particularly having a good view of the market and the revenue that potentially could come out of a project. I think often governments see private investment as an opportunity for them to leverage, but if there isn't a revenue stream and a clear market, that project's never going to be successful for investment. So I think a real sense of realism is critical in before you even get started with any particular project. It's already been alluded to earlier, the importance of project preparation. In my view, the employment of professional teams and people is critical to project preparation. I think that there are lots of practitioners around the globe that know how to do this properly. And whilst local content is important, we've got to make sure that we have the right people running those preparation activities and drawing others and building the capacity of others in that process. So not only does it mean that you're properly preparing projects, but you're also building confidence of the private sector investors on the other side that these projects have been properly tackled by competent people. Then the importance of market engagement can't be underestimated, and you can never engage the market too early. I think the opportunity from market engagement is the ability to properly structure projects, to test the appetite from business, to workshop how you can better manage the risk of the projects. I think there are a number of successes in this space, and I think the one that's the most regularly cited is the success of the South African IPP program, where there was very, very early engagement with the market to understand how that whole program could be structured to manage the risk, both of investors and project developers. So again, you can never start that process too early. It's a shame to get far down the road and then have to backtrack to resolve issues that you could have identified earlier. And then, I think from a government perspective, in being realistic about infrastructure, the importance of infrastructure master plans, setting priorities, understanding the best source of funds for different projects, such that you can better allocate the investable projects to the investment sector, and ensure that you get the best blend between your government, fiscus, and private investment. So I think proper planning about your portfolio of projects and what your priorities is critical in this space. So nothing new that I think I would have shared with you, but just to further endorse what's always been said in this space, the importance of proper planning and proper market engagement from an early stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. No, we have agreed with you because indeed the proper planning, including the realistic master plan, those are the key factors that can indeed help to reduce the negative perception that people might have in terms of investment. Let's move now to Mr. Brown. Monsieur Brown, qui est le directeur principal de African Center for Economic Transformation. La question, c'est de savoir à l'heure actuelle, 80% des projets d'infrastructure échouent à l'étape surtout de la faisabilité et de la planification. Alors, quelles sont selon vous, M. Brown, 2 ou 3 contraintes majeures qui freinent l'aboutissement de ces projets d'infrastructure en Afrique? Merci.
Yeah, thank you, Jean-Denis. I'm very happy to participate in this discussion this morning. This is a very important subject as it's at the core of Africa's integration and economic transformation. To answer your question, I would like to refer to a report that the OECD Development Center and Asset published last year entitled Quality Infrastructure in 21st Century Africa. This report was based on a number of case studies and expert meetings to help accelerate infrastructure project cycles. The report came out with 2 important recommendations. The first recommendation was to promote the use of PIDA quality label for all infrastructure projects across Africa, thus ensuring a consistent quality level in all Africa infrastructure projects. The second recommendation was to create a community of practice of African infrastructure practitioners and a platform for knowledge sharing and peer learning. We are pleased that these recommendations have been endorsed by the AU heads of state, and with the OECD Development Center, ODA, Nepad, and other partners, we are moving towards implementation. The report identified a wide range of gaps and challenges to infrastructure project preparation. The research illustrated that the time taken for all elements of infrastructure projects almost always stretches over many years. Of course, such problems are by no means unique to African infrastructure projects, but Africa's demography and transformation challenges are unique. current upstream processes are not generating pipelines of ready-to-go quality infrastructure investments, projects on a scale commensurate with the demographic dynamics. Effective commitment between and within countries and financing mechanisms are missing for the creation of cross-border infrastructure essential in such a large continent with many landlocked countries. We see slow project development match the dynamic and interactions involved in integrating regional corridor development or programs that generate the many small projects that will provide the bulk of infrastructure services at the national level. Upstream processes are required for cross-border infrastructure, along with commitment and financing mechanisms that make implementation possible and sustainable. To answer your question, if I have to focus on 2 to 3 gaps holding back effectiveness and efficiency in the delivery of African infrastructure, first, I will point to the pre-development phase, where there are unsatisfactory feasibility studies and delays in meeting the ESG guidelines. The second, I will point to the procurement phase, where we see many inefficient procurement processes, corruption, and complex negotiations. And third, I would look at the construction phase, where there is often suboptimal contractor performance, multiple design changes, and delays, and a lack of upfront focus on maintenance. I should perhaps also add a fourth element, which is the unfavorable conditions for private finance, weak institutional framework, lack of risk protection, complex negotiations, and suboptimal prioritization of financing sources. There are good practices globally, and of course also across the continent, to address these gaps and challenges. But we need to do more to identify those good practices and to share them among African infrastructure experts. In our forthcoming Africa Transformation Report, entitled Integrate to Transform, ASSET highlights the central role of regional public goods, of which transnational or cross-border infrastructure are key to integration. One core issue that needs to be considered is that transnational connectivity, that is transport, ICT connectivity, and so on, are quasi-public goods, or what you might call pub goods. And their total provision is limited to the contribution of the weakest link. In other words, the failure of one country's infrastructure reduces the performance of a network. The blockage of one part of a network reduces or eliminates gains to all. Thus, to ensure adequate provision, what we are advocating for are efforts needed to focus on targeting financial and capacity building support to the weakest link members, often the least endowed or poorest countries or actors, to boost their contribution to the level of what is expected. In this regard, I think the multinational institutions like the World Bank and the AFDB and other regional organizations can play a critical role in shoring up the weakest link. Now, for effective implementation, if I may add, just as a last observation, is that it is important to consider establishing or strengthening existing structures of supranational authorities that facilitates harmonizing regulations, building of trust, negotiating incentives, and navigating the political landscape. The AFCFTA, PIDA, AUDA, Nepad offer opportunities to do exactly that. I will stop here for the moment.
Thank you so very much, my brother. Now I'm back to my original screen. No, we have now learned from you, especially about that joint report with OECD. We'll make sure to have those key recommendations that really address the issue of the gap that affect the planning of infrastructure project in Africa. So now let's move to Madame Louise Kanyonga, qui est la responsable donc de la stratégie et de la conformité au Rwanda Development Board. Et ici, ce que l'on voudrait savoir, c'est un peu les leçons en fait, la pratique au Rwanda. Quelles sont les leçons pratiques que pouvons-nous tirer de l'expérience du Rwanda dans la mobilisation de l'investissement privé pour les infrastructures, que ce soit par le biais des PPP, les projets de PPP ou alors d'autres mécanismes de participation du secteur privé. Qu'est-ce que vous avez comme expérience à partager avec les autres États africains au niveau du Rwanda? Madame Kanyonga, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, very good.
Okay, great. So I'll go ahead. Thank you once again. We are equally very excited to be part of this conversation, which I think, as everyone has said, really comes at the right time, as we're all seeking ways as African countries and even just globally to accelerate recovery and resilient growth in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, to your question in terms of Rwanda's practical experience in mobilizing private investments into strategic sectors such as infrastructure, I think really the starting point for us, goes back to almost 2 decades ago, when as a country we embarked on a very ambitious agenda to reform the business environment, to make it conducive for the private sector to participate in the key sectors of the economy. It was very apparent to us from very early on that the private sector was going to have to be the backbone of driving growth for the country. And to do this, we really focused on a very holistic effort and looking at what were the key fundamentals if we were going to achieve a development agenda that is driven by the private sector, which, to be honest, was really the most sustainable way for us to rebuild and sustain. Now, first, and I think this has been mentioned by many people, was that we had to make sure that we had a capable state with systems that work. And this was very key for us to create confidence in the private sector. So just to give you some key examples, the government of Rwanda has a zero tolerance policy to corruption. And today Rwanda is among the 3 least corrupt countries in Africa, with very transparent and very clear regulations and institutions. We also invested very heavily in security, and today Rwanda is the fifth safest country globally when it comes to safety and security. Now, these stable macroeconomic and political conditions are extremely important, especially for private investment, where you need to make sure that you have predictability, you have transparency and efficiency that will facilitate trade and investment. Secondly, we made sure that we put in place very, sweeping regulatory and institutional reforms to improve the doing business climate. And I think, this is something that we've put in place since 2000. Several laws changed, several institutions put in place, but also really harnessing the benefits of technology to automate and digitize processes where you have interaction between the government and the private sector. And thanks to all these different reforms, Rwanda is now the 2nd easiest place to do business. So I started with this because that was really the foundation, very important for us and for African countries, because when we're talking about sectors like infrastructure, this inevitably requires that we mobilize external investments. The scale, and the nature of these investments does require harnessing partnerships. And for us to be able to do that, we realized early on that we needed to be able to compete on a global stage. And if you're competing on the global stage, I think this has been mentioned very clearly again, we had to be able to mitigate both the real and the perceived risks that are associated with investing in Africa. And for us, we believe that one of the most important ways to start with this was improving the regulatory environment, making it conducive for business, but also very importantly, encouraging transparency and efficiency. Now, with this foundation, we had a good starting point for us to be able to mobilize investments into critical sectors, such as infrastructure. And I think, as most of you would know, that with a sector like infrastructure, PPPs were obviously a very key vehicle for us to be able to harness both the public and private sector, leveraging on those respective strengths to drive investments in this sector. And our experience has been that PPPs have been largely successful, but mostly because they have been anchored in a very strong regulatory and institutional framework. So for the regulatory framework, we have very clear PPP laws and regulations. On the institutional front, we have a steering committee, we have a contracting authorities, and then we have the Rwanda Development Board that kind of plays point as the coordinating unit and the leading negotiator on behalf of government. This comprehensive framework really does allow for you to have clear, efficient, transparent processes. Our PP process is very clearly outlined all the way from project preparation to procurement, very clear alignment in terms of roles and responsibilities, but also importantly, it makes sure that there's policy coherence. So it's very key for you to have clear direction on what are your priority sectors as a country, and making sure that the PPP focus for the RDB as we're attracting investments is very much aligned to these national priorities. And we have several successful examples, joint that have been done with private investors in the space of ICT, infrastructure development, such as our airports and so on, which perhaps we could come to later. But just to sum up, I think if I were to extract what the few key lessons from the Rwanda experience are, one is to invest in the foundation of a conducive business environment. Now, this requires a bold start. And if I could borrow Peter's words, you can never start too early with this. You don't have to wait for all the conditions to be ready. As long as there is political will, improve as you go, because waiting is far too costly. Rwanda started from a very low base 25 years ago, but we had a willingness to learn from the best. The second is that resilience must be built structurally. You have to have very structural reforms. This obviously requires you to have strong, transparent institutions, very clear governance and coordination structures. The time and the effort that you spend in laying the right foundations by establishing clear regulatory and operating frameworks is extremely key in attracting the right type of private sector investments. Strong policy coordination and institutional coordination. There has to be very clear policy coherence and alignment in relation to the priorities. And finally, building capacity by doing. To build the required capacity and expertise that everyone has mentioned in terms of packaging bankable projects, you must start somewhere. And so important to start with one-off projects that will deliver that experience and build confidence in the ability of government to develop programs later. You can co-opt external expertise to help you start off with this, but it's important to make sure that you are enabling knowledge transfer to the local expertise as you go along. So those are just some of the few examples that I could pick from Rwanda's experience, and hopefully we can come back to some of these later in the interactive discussions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so very much, Mrs. Louise. Nous venons donc en fait d'apprendre beaucoup en effet à propos concernant en fait les fondamentaux du modèle rwandais plutôt, qui concerne en fait donc, comme elle venait de le dire, un cadre macroéconomique, l'environnement qui prospère donc aux affaires. Il y a la lutte contre la corruption, il y a la sécurité, il y a la transport, la transparence, il y a la coordination au niveau national qui sont des outils essentiels pour assurer un environnement macroéconomique des affaires propice aux investissements. Alors, nous avons passé à la deuxième série de questions. Donc, nous allons revenir à M. Adoum, juste pour essayer un peu de revenir aux éléments que vous allez indiquer tout à l'heure à propos du modèle, en fait, de ce que des initiatives au niveau du Nepad. Donc, ici, la deuxième question, c'est en fait de dire que, alors que le PIDA entre donc dans sa deuxième phase de mise en œuvre, pourriez-vous nous dire ou donner des détails sur les nouvelles approches et instruments du AODA Nepad pour concrétiser les plus grands projets en Afrique d'infrastructure, le plus grand nombre de projets d'infrastructure en Afrique? Est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire quelles sont les nouvelles approches et les instruments qui sont développés au niveau du Nepad. Monsieur Adoum, please.
Merci beaucoup, Jean-Denis. Alors, notre agence va coordonner la mise en œuvre des projets PIDA à travers une approche de corridor intégré. Je pense qu'on a parlé beaucoup de l'approche corridor intégré pour le développement des infrastructures en Afrique. Et l'objectif de cette approche, bien entendu, est de faire en sorte que le développement des infrastructures fonctionne de façon durable pour les collectivités, pour l'environnement, mais aussi et surtout un élément très important pour les micros, les petites et les moyennes entreprises. Je vais revenir tout à l'heure sur cet élément. Donc, parallèlement à cette approche, ou plutôt avec cette approche du corridor intégré, nous avons développé plusieurs outils, plusieurs instruments. L'un des premiers, c'est le PIDA Quality Label, qui est censé assurer l'excellence dans la gestion des projets d'infrastructure, depuis leur préparation précoce jusqu'à leur mise en œuvre. Donc, le PIDA Quality Label, PQL, est une reconnaissance d'étiquette, si vous voulez, qui devrait permettre la réalisation d'un plus grand, ou plutôt l'achèvement d'un plus grand nombre de projets grâce à une approche beaucoup plus coordonnée avec d'autres niveaux de préparation depuis le niveau institutionnel jusqu'à leur mise en œuvre. J'ai évoqué tout à l'heure le SDM, qui est le Service Delivery Mechanism. Donc, le SDM qui s'occupe surtout de la phase de préparation des projets. Souvent, on parle de préparation de projets, mais on néglige, ou plutôt, on ne s'investit pas suffisamment dans la phase de préparation de projet, Early Project Preparation. Donc, le SDM va se concentrer sur cette étape aussi. Cette étape, elle est cruciale, bien entendu. Nous avons vu que beaucoup de projets, en fait, connaissent des échecs parce que la phase de préparation est négligée. Nous avons donc, au sein de notre équipe de SDM, grâce au soutien de nos partenaires institutionnels, créé donc une équipe multidisciplinaire qui va s'occuper de cette phase de préparation. Nous avons déjà démontré à travers plusieurs études que c'est une phase extrêmement cruciale. La mise en œuvre du AIGM, donc, qui est Africa Infrastructure Guarantee Mechanism, la mise en œuvre du AIGM avec aussi la plateforme CGP de la BAC, nous a permis de réunir sur une même plateforme plusieurs compagnies d'assurance, des assureurs, des gestionnaires de risques, ainsi que des banques publiques et des banques de développement pour faire le travail indispensable de réduction du risque, ou plutôt de réduction de la perception du risque macroéconomique, politique et institutionnel en Afrique. Donc, notre travail avec AIGM permettra aussi d'encourager les fonds de pension africains, et ça, c'est important, de pouvoir mettre en œuvre l'agenda des 5%. Je pense que cet agenda, la mise en œuvre de cet agenda, elle est cruciale. L'idée ici est de demander aux investisseurs africains, et puis spécialement les gestionnaires de fonds de pension, de pousser pour pouvoir mettre au moins 5% de leurs assets sur les projets d'investissement en Afrique. C'est crucial. Aujourd'hui, la plupart des fonds d'investissement qui gèrent les fonds de pension africains, les fonds de retraite africains, de fonctionnaires africains, préfèrent investir à l'extérieur du continent. Et notre rôle, c'est de les encourager à venir investir aussi sur le continent, parce que notre continent n'est pas aussi risqué qu'on le dit. Alors, je voudrais insister sur un point important, je l'avais évoqué tout à l'heure pour nous. Nous pensons que les projets d'investissement, plutôt les projets d'infrastructure, leur mise en œuvre effective peut permettre, ou plutôt permettra de créer des emplois et permettra vraiment de faire une mise en œuvre effective des politiques de création d'emplois en Afrique. Donc, dans ce sens, l'ODA-Nepad a créé un mécanisme continental qui vise à connecter les projets d'infrastructure, mais aussi les projets d'industrialisation, les projets agricoles aussi, les projets de commercialisation, en fait, tous les projets dans la gamme, si vous voulez, dans le spectre économique, les connecter ensemble. Donc, ce projet s'appelle le projet 100 000 PME. En réalité, 100 000 PME, c'est juste le nom. C'est un projet qui vise à soutenir 1,5 million de micro, de petites et de moyennes entreprises en Afrique chaque année. Vous savez, il y a environ 100 millions de micro, de petites et de moyennes entreprises en Afrique, dont seulement 8% sont structurés et sont formalisés. Donc, notre objectif est de les soutenir à travers la formation, de pouvoir aussi les structurer, de faciliter leur accès au financement, mais surtout, à travers ce soutien, de pouvoir faciliter leur accès aux marchés publics, les marchés publics d'infrastructures. Vous savez très bien que les infrastructures sont les principaux générateurs de marchés publics. Or, en ce moment, les micros, les petites et les moyennes entreprises africaines accèdent difficilement aux marchés publics. Mais en même temps, ce sont ces MPME, les micros, les petites et les moyennes entreprises africaines, qui sont les principales créatrices d'emplois. Il y a environ 360, en 2020, par exemple, en Afrique, nous avons comptabilisé 60 millions de postes d'emploi dans le secteur public, tous les secteurs publics confondus, 66 millions de postes d'emploi dans tous les secteurs privés, donc des grosses entreprises privées, des entreprises qui font plus de 100 personnes et au-delà. Mais les MPME, à elles seules, comptabilisent 360 millions d'emplois. Vous voyez? Donc, il est important de pouvoir les connecter et de pouvoir leur donner un accès facilité au marché public des infrastructures. Pour nous, c'est important. Et donc, pour finir, je voudrais ajouter qu'il est important que l'Afrique puisse réellement tirer parti des ressources intérieures, bien sûr, mais aussi des ressources extérieures. Mais pour pouvoir tirer parti des ressources intérieures, nous devons nous concentrer sur les projets d'investissement institutionnel. C'est important. Nous devons aussi vraiment améliorer la mobilisation des ressources domestiques. Et pour pouvoir améliorer la mobilisation des ressources domestiques, c'est important d'améliorer nos capacités, si vous voulez, spécialement nos capacités de gestion fiscale et nos capacités de recouvrement fiscal. Pour le moment, la plupart des pays africains connaissent des contre-performances dans ce domaine parce que nous avons des fonctions publiques qui sont déstructurées, qui sont faibles. Et dans ce sens, notre agence travaille aussi à pouvoir aider nos États à vraiment améliorer leur mécanisme de gouvernance en matière de recouvrement des ressources domestiques. Donc, voilà ce que je veux. Je vais arrêter ici. Je crois que vous le voyez bien, la mise en œuvre des projets d'infrastructure en Afrique ne peut pas se faire ne peut pas se faire de manière unique. Il s'agit vraiment d'intervenir sur tous les éléments, toutes les étapes de la chaîne des valeurs. Pour nous, c'est extrêmement important. On ne se concentre pas seulement sur les infrastructures. Quand on parle de pré-préparation des projets, c'est l'étape qui nous permet véritablement de mieux connaître le contexte institutionnel du pays dans lequel nous intervenons ou du pays qui est le promoteur du projet et de pouvoir proposer des solutions qui vont donc depuis les études de pré-préparation jusqu'à pouvoir connecter ces projets d'infrastructure au plan de développement global et puis en investissant davantage et de plus en plus sur le rôle des micros, des petites et des moyennes entreprises. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, M. Adoum, pour ces éléments additionnels concernant donc des différents mécanismes et instruments mis en place par ODA Nepad pour effectivement faire de façon à ce que les projets d'infrastructure ou différents projets, comme vous l'avez évoqué, soient des projets bancables et capables d'être mis en œuvre. Nous allons passer à Mr. Peter Vandel. The second question, what are the key assets that you see the private sector bringing to the financing, management, and implementation of infrastructure projects, and how can this engagement be facilitated? Mr. Peter, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think the first is, I think, fairly obvious in the reason for this call, for this discussion, which is obviously finance and the ability of the private sector to bring in additional money to extend national government's budgets and effectively allowing for more to be done. And I think that's a well-recognized concept and the reason we're chatting today. But I think more importantly, from a management and implementation perspective, particularly the operators of infrastructure, they bring expertise, efficiencies, technologies, and particularly in the contract environment, they work in the ability to have to be efficient to leverage the full value of the assets that they may have invested into. So I think, in that space, there's particularly the efficiency in the technology side, which is critical. How can it be facilitated? Again, not a huge difference to what I already said earlier, but there needs to be a forward-looking view of infrastructure needs and priorities, and I think that we all accept. They need to be regularly reviewed and updated. The infrastructure development plans, and flowing from that, you need to regularly review and implement policy responses to what your plans and priorities may be. I think it's critical to maintain some form of an infrastructure priority list. And then obviously finally you move into the project preparation, which everybody's discussed today, and those activities are critical. I think those principles are fairly sound, and I think most of us will buy into that. I would say that, again, coming back to the theme I had earlier, is the importance of regular engagement with business in all of these processes, from the forward-looking needs and priorities, to looking at development plans, to looking at the policy requirements and responses, to project preparation. It's never too early. And I think probably the biggest difference in my view is where we get it wrong is, the engagement with business shouldn't just deal with infrastructure practitioners. So typically we all engage with the financiers and some of the project developers and the construction companies and technology providers, but we need to engage with the users. Critically, they are the ones that will be using and paying for infrastructure in the long term, and we need to understand their needs and their appetite to pay for the infrastructure to be put in place. So I would always advocate for broadening the market engagement and the testing to beyond those that are obvious in terms of preparing the project. So that's my contribution, and happy that we can pick that up at another time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Peter, for those additional inputs. Let's now quickly move to Mr. Brown. Talking about the continental platform for knowledge that you just mentioned earlier, knowledge sharing, I mean. How can this help African countries fill the gap in knowledge preparations? You have already almost touched it in your previous presentation. So can you just elaborate more, please?
Okay, I will be very brief on that. Thank you again, Denny. I think there is unanimity that African countries need to rapidly accelerate infrastructure investment. And to do so, we must address the identified gaps and challenges. And I think these platforms are critical in ensuring that we can share good practices and learn from failures. African infrastructure experts, in particular, need to understand what knowledge is available and then adapt to the country context. They must experiment, replicate, and scale to reduce project cycle timeframes, and ensure quality infrastructure, and also ensure efficient financing for the infrastructure. So, for example, the Joint Africa Union Commission, OECD platform, investment productive transformation is one good example of such continental initiatives for knowledge sharing. The 3 work streams of human capital, integration, mobilizing investment, and for connectivity are well positioned to complement other platforms. We need to be careful, though, that we are not creating competing initiatives. But in this case, we at Asset see strong alignment. For example, the accelerating and scaling of quality infrastructure investment in Africa being implemented by OECD Development Department and ODA and Asset is creating a community of practice of African infrastructure experts. And we will develop knowledge and peer learning platforms for that experts to learn from each other. And of course, Nepad and PIDA processes have an important continental role to play, and we congratulate them on the PIDA Priority Action Plan 2. The Infrastructure Consortium for Africa is another continental platform that works to catalyze projects, particularly related to financing. Africa also benefits from global platforms such as the G20 and the Global Infrastructure Hub of the World Bank and Global Infrastructure Facility. Again, we at Asset are particularly excited to see the Joint Africa Union Commission OECD Development Center on Investment Productive Transformation being developed. And given that it's a new initiative, now is the time to ensure complementarity with other initiatives. This should be informed by both policymakers and private sector. And we do hope that we can use knowledge and learning to fill the gaps and perpetuate the infrastructure deficit in Africa. Because there is clearly a knowledge gap and there's a need to harness this knowledge through the platform. And I think this is very much akin to the Asia Pacific, economic cooperation, where they have clearly defined strategies and approaches that brings the countries together to share experience and coordinate. And I think one issue that was raised by the Rwandan Development Board speaker was that policy coordination and institutional coordinations are going to be key. And such platforms offer us a tremendous opportunity for knowledge sharing, comparing, experiences, and creating traction at the national and local level. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Brown, for those additional, again, elements to what you just shared with us in your previous intervention regarding the knowledge sharing and the establishment of this platform that will, of course, indeed help somehow, our African countries to fill those gaps. Let's move to Mrs. Kanyonga. She also touched a bit on the Rwanda's strategies put in place to facilitate the investment. But knowing as a landlocked country and depending on the trade, what concretely the investment strategy Rwanda pursued to strengthen its regional and global connectivity, including its digital connectivity, which may become more important in the post-COVID period world?
Thank you very much. So indeed, for countries like Rwanda, it's very important for us to enhance our global regional connectivities and also to harness the benefits of technology. So again, looking back at, what are the fundamentals you need to have in place for that, we had to invest very heavily in scaling up our IT infrastructure. And so, as a result, we have today, Rwanda being one of the most ICT ready countries, we have over 7,000 kilometers of fiber optic that were laid across the country. And as I said, this was part of a PPP that we had with Korea Telecom and the government of Rwanda. And we also have 95% 4G LTE coverage. And this really provides the backbone of very modern, fast ICT infrastructure on which you can then go on to leverage key private sector partnerships that can enhance, regional and global trade. And as you said, in a post-COVID world, e-commerce and, looking at some of these digital ways to connect our different economies is going to become very important. And one of the key partnerships that we have been able to leverage in this regard is the Electronic World Trade Platform, which is a project between the government of Rwanda and the Alibaba Group that we concluded in 2018, really looking at how to develop the digital economy and make it easier for Rwandan companies to participate in global trade. And this obviously requires upskilling our companies, our SMEs, putting in place e-payment channels, online trading, e-commerce platforms, and so on. Other strategic, investments and initiatives that we have put in place to enhance our regional and global connectivity. One is our national carrier, Rwandair, which we have invested heavily in. Aviation obviously provides, a very interesting proposition for enhancing connectivity. And so we boosted our national carrier, which today is flying to about 28 cities in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Europe, and we have new routes that are planned to New York, Paris, and even Malawi. The cargo capacity of the airline is something that we're now going to be focusing on going forward because it has proved for us, especially during this pandemic, extremely crucial. And we plan to double our current fleet by 2023 for the national carrier. Another strategic investment that we undertook was the Kigali logistic platform. Again, this is another PPP that we concluded with Dubai Ports from the United Arab Emirates. It's a state-of-the-art inland cargo handling facility, and really is aiming at bringing us closer to our aspiration of being a regional logistics hub, and looking at how we can reduce, turnaround time for logistics from 10 to 14 days to about just 3 days. The other key initiative that we're pursuing is establishing platforms to attract Pan-African talent and innovation. We have a Kigali Innovation City. It's a flagship program that we are, really using to bring in innovation and talent from across the continent, help us to transition to a knowledge-based economy, but really tap into the expertise that we have across the continent. Within the Kigali Innovation City, we have anchor universities that currently have around 35 African countries that are represented. To complement this, we've also undertaken a very liberal visa regime to enable freer movement of people and goods, across from the continent and into Rwanda. Currently, we have a visa-free policy for all nationals of the AU, the Commonwealth, and La Francophonie. And then finally, I guess we cannot speak about regional connectivity without talking about the different regional and continental initiatives, such as the economic trading blocks, as well as the AFCFTA, which will be very instrumental in building regional trade that is resilient to crisis. We saw this during the COVID-19 lockdown. Regional trade at the borders largely continued, and this enabled us to ensure that food supply and trade in essential goods was not disrupted. And so we believe that this will be key to continue consolidating and to enable regional investments in each other's economies is further deepened. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Louise, for those key, elements in addition to what you just highlighted in your previous presentation. So now we have come to the end of our first panel. Just to highlight the fact that we have learned about how the Nepad strategies, mechanisms, all the instruments put in place or in development to facilitate the preparation and the financing and even the implementation of a project. We have also learned from the private sector perspective, the mean put in place to make sure that private sector be more involved in the investment in the area of infrastructure, and also for the successful implementation of this project, and if also making this project to be more bankable. As we have said, we have learned the importance of Rwanda's model, because Rwanda's model is really one of the best model that can also be benchmarked or disseminated in all African countries. That include policies, regulatory mechanisms, all the infrastructure, digitalization, and all the coordination at the country level. So we have learned a lot from this key presentation. So we just want to express our appreciation and gratitude to all the panelists, and wish you well for your next, in the work that you are doing. And now we can move to our second panel. I'm sure that all our panelists are around. Mr. Luis, I think Mr. Luis, I can see Jose Luis is connected. We are also, His Excellency Mr. Kato is also connected. We have Mr. Michael Landabazo. Yes, thank you. You are also connected, and Geoffrey White. Good. So let me just now. This second panel is mainly based on the discussion regarding the physical and soft infrastructure connectivity. And we are going to share the experience, like Mario said from the beginning, of the Latin America, as well as the experience of Asia and EU in the soft infrastructure agenda. And we can, of course, in this new environment post-conflict, and also discuss about the gap in the soft infrastructure in Africa post-COVID. So let's quickly move. Like I've said, Mr. Luis, he is the former head of the World Bank expert team on investment, PPP and logistic. Mr. Richie Kato is the vice president of JICA, the Japan International Corporation. Mr. Mikel Londabazo is the director of joint research of the Central European Commission. And lastly, Mr. Geoffrey White is the CEO for Africa in Agility. So the first round of questions, let's move to Mr. Luis Jose. What are the key soft elements that you think need to be systematically mainstreamed into integrated infrastructure strategies? Mr. Luis, please. Your mic is muted.
Okay, thank you very much. I am very pleased to be here to share the experience that have taken place around the world, particularly in Latin America, on this critical sector. I have worked extensively on this area in Latin America, as well as in other countries, including Africa. The critical thing here, I call it the logistic / infrastructure quagmire. The numbers and the impact are definitely not pretty. We have a collection of themes, a collection of elements which again are not in place to be able to secure these objectives that we have described. Starting from, as I mentioned, the investment in infrastructure, the productivity elements, the collection of merchandise that is being moved, the critical points, and so on and so forth. I will concentrate again on two critical issues which has been asked. One is the, how to improve again connectivity, and second, the critical elements of the soft infrastructure, which unfortunately they are really missing. On the issue of the connectivity, clearly there are the two critical elements. One is the physical connectivity, and the other one is the digital or the virtual connectivity. And again, both of them are lagging in most countries again. The issues, some of them has been already touched in the previous panel, which is the need somehow to increase the investment in infrastructure, but doing it right, particularly bringing the private sector. Again, unfortunately, the PPPs can be a very powerful instrument, to secure and reduce the investment in infrastructure gap. Yet things are not really done properly. A number of mistakes have been done and are being done. And again, that is a little bit frustrating because as of today, we do know exactly how best to do it. Yet, I do see again a collection of problems. Recently I finished basically a paper, or it's coming to a book, which illustrates the critical mistakes which are being done. And again, that can and should be avoided. Again, on how to identify the projects, how to implement and design the projects, both in the digital side, on the investment side. So that is really critical to come out again with a coherent planning and selection of projects. And again, it has to be coherent. Sometimes what really concerns me is that I see often what I would call Napoleonic plans on how to improve the infrastructure, which again, they are not credible and cannot be somehow achieved. The issue is that to come up with a criteria, understanding that there are obviously critical elements in terms of the financing, in terms of the capacity, and in terms of the knowledge. So indeed, you have to come up with a credible and workable portfolio of projects which do have complementarities and achieve the objectives that we want. Typical mistake of examples could be, for example, that indeed, you develop a new road who connects critical part of the country, yet you do not develop the port where this road tends to end up with. So you tend to lose the benefit of having this wonderful new road because the port is not really ready and set up to absorb, the products which are being moved and that. So this is quite critical to have this platform. Critical things to go advance in this direction is to basically start with the identification of the critical corridors. Critical corridors. Corridors are basically the elements which move both people and products. And you have somehow to identify in each country, again, what are the critical corridors that need to be improved and developed, understanding that they are constrained on financing and in capacity. And that, again, quite often, it is not done. So once again, a critical element is to come up with this portfolio of projects, we identify the critical corridors, again, and the capacities and the information that needs to be in place to be able to make them operative and move people and products accordingly. Again, for that, once again, you need a PPP program. Again, I will not dwell too much into this thing because that has been covered in the previous panel. But again, what I really urge is somehow to bring the best practices that you can reach the World Bank, you can reach the African Development Bank, and through them, you can really somehow avoid the mistakes which have been done, unfortunately, in the past, whatever, 20 or 30 years. Today, more than 10,000 PPPs have been done around the world. Sure, there have been problems. Sure, everything has not been rosy, but we know why and how to avoid them. Again, that is really a critical element that needs to be addressed. But again, infrastructure alone is not going to solve the problem because, again, the issues are what call the soft part of the logistic platform of the logistic infrastructure. Okay? For that, to have in place every country, and it has been described, the elements of a successful strategies, they basically start with solid and credible macro framework, a trade policy and access to markets, the tariff regime and non-tariff regime, and the free trade treaties and what have you. You need to have an exportable and production supply that identify the basket of products, the quality standards, the human capital, the knowledge transfer, cluster and value chains. Then the critical element is the logistic and trade facilitation, which has two elements, the hardware, which is infrastructure, and the software, which is the associated services and the trade procedures. Okay? All that has to be clearly supported by an institutionality in the country, which is got to be with the export trade facilitation, the quality agency, innovation agency, the PPP unit, the competitive council, and so on and so forth, and ideally an overall decent investment climate, which quite often, again, still is to be developed in a number of countries in a very effective ways. Now, what are the elements of this infrastructure and logistics platform on the hardware and the software? On the hardware, it's critical, as I mentioned, to identify so-called the production or export corridors, which involve, and in a coherent and complementarity way, highways, railways, ports, and feeder roads. You need to have a network of service sites and silos, which I'll describe more on the soft side, which allow somehow for the maintenance and restoring and maintaining the quality of the products. The ports are critical. Again, and quite often there have been significant advances, but again, things are not as good as they ought to be. Airports go along the same side. You need to think about the logistic terminal dry ports and the network, the warehousing and the hub market network, and supported by a decent energy sector somehow to supply those elements that are needed to move project forwards. Fine. This is the hardware. Again, it has been described. I will not dwell much into it, but let's go again to the software part, which is critical. Again, the element that it has been quite critical, particularly affecting the smaller producers, is again how to bring the products to the market. Quite often that is not really properly in place. Critical elements which are missing is really the warehousing and consolidation, and being with that is the treatment of the cold chains and the packaging, that one. It's amazing the percentage of products which do not reach the market. I mean, the numbers that I have identified all around basically the world, a lot of Latin America, illustrate that quite often, again, the production and the number of products who do not reach the market, it is between 30% and 50%, particularly in for a small producer. I mean, that again, it's really a very critical element that needs again to be addressed. How that is really taken care of? Well, as I mentioned, I have worked extensively on the issues that to go not for the macro level necessarily, but the micro level, which meaning looking at a specific value change. And I did look, I mean, overall, an extensive number of products in detail, starting from the coffee, the cocoa, the issue of textiles, the issue of mining, and the issue of a collection of agricultural products, fishing, and the like. Through that, you identify, again, what are the critical elements which are damaging, again, the value change of moving this product forward from production, again, to the market. And again, a critical element has been really the consolidation, the packing, and then the cool chain. Quite often I give the example is that, I mean, you collect avocados in the farm, in the market, and by the time they reach the market, you don't have avocados, you have guacamole. Why? Because the critical elements are the quality of the roads and the packing and the lack of cool services. And that will damage the product if we go to there. How do you solve that? Well, what we have done is create a network of service sites or silos, which they pick up and really consolidate the production of whatever. Pick up a single product and brought into this facility, which has cooling facilities, and as well as the truckings, which have cooling elements, and packing them in a proper way so that they can reach the market in a good condition. So you reduce the losses, which are, again, I mentioned, they are significantly more than 30%, and to reduce the losses to a level of 6%, which is, or 10% at the maximum, which is what you have to aim at like that. So that is a critical element, the consolidation and the packing and the cooling facilities. And quite often that has been done through PPPs. And I've done that in a number of countries. India has been perhaps the leading, has extensively been done there, but has also been applied again in Latin America and even in some African countries as well. You need to have in the soft side the issue of that inspections, licensing, and the certification platform, including the digitalization of the certificates of origin. The issue that to reduce times and reduce losses. And that, again, it will be a critical element to improve the productivity and the welfare, particularly of the small producers. You have to focus on the cross-border crossing, custom procedures, implement dedicated and privileged lines at border crossing somehow to avoid, long delays, which quite often is the case, affecting obviously the deterioration of the product. That one. You need to develop the associativity of the producers, again, reaching scale effects, which can be developed into, again, a consolidated production and the packing, which will arrive and make the products effective and durable into the market. For that, you need this network of warehousing and consolidation of practices, that where the packaging is going to be a critical element, which is missing in a collection of number of countries, and that one. Same thing on the transport services. The transport services quite often are quite informal and not really well established. And that leads to informality, which leads again to a lacking of effectiveness in the moving of products or people from their origin to the market. Likewise, the elements of the insurance services, whenever it's appropriate, again, they are really improperly developed and the like. That is critical somehow to achieve these elements that we want to have in place. That one. All these elements, again, needs to be in place to be able to have this effective, that one. The institutionality, you have to have export zones, which somehow facilitates, the in situ production, packaging, and distribution. Tracking services and the cold chains, I remain emphasizing the critical elements to have the cold chain, particularly again, obviously for infrastructure products, for perishable agricultural products and the like. That one. That quite often, again, is one of the weaker points that we need to have in place. Critically, you need to start with the corridors and converge again to the elements on the soft scale, that on the soft side, that will bring these policies into effect. Quite often on the knowledge side, what has been done is to develop these in situ knowledge centers, which call centers for transfer of knowledge, which are very specific for a product. It could be on a grape, it could be again on the fish, it could be on the apple, it could be on the whatever. But again, those elements are to assist the producers to be able to produce in a more effective and knowledgeable fashion. That has been quite effective. Spain was one of the leaders, and that has been transferred in Latin America in a number of places. Again, bringing the welfare and the earnings of small producers to a very significant levels by somehow transferring the knowledge of how they have to do that. Let me stop right here again, and I'd be happy to enter into greater detail in many of these elements of the soft side, which again, quite often are missing. We concentrate on the infrastructure, which is right up to a point, but you are missing the soft elements of the logistic platform, which are the most critical to achieve somehow the movement of the products to the value chains from the production to the market. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Jose, for sharing the experience from your region. That's, of course, you have shared the critical element to be mainstream in infrastructure strategy. That, of course, includes the identification of corridors, the design and planning, the coherence in planning also, the complementarity, the licensing, digitalization for, reducing time, and also the packaging. So we are really appreciating this intervention. So now let's move in, given the time constraint, please, let's stick to 5-minute intervention so that also we can have time for the second round of questions. Let's move to Mr. Kaito. From the Japanese perspective, what are the gaps in soft infrastructure in Africa, and what are the best practices or lessons in advancing soft infrastructure agenda and creating integrated connectivity strategies, in your views? Mr. Kaito, please.
Thank you, Gianni. Can you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you, yeah. Please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you so much for your invitation, and I'm very glad to, delighted to participate in the discussion. I prepared the slides, so next, please. I'd like to introduce our activities and experiences. In CICAT, you know, that Tokyo International Conference on African Development, 5th edition in 2013, JICA has launched the Corridor Development Initiative in Africa. This aligns the PDAP PAP1 to promote Africa's own initiative and ownership for development. Next slide, please. Next, please. Yes, JICA formulated corridor development master plans in the 3 regions. Northern Corridor, which is shown in this slide, linking Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, LDC, and South Sudan. And also the Nakala Corridor in Mozambique and the neighboring Malawi and Zambia. And the West African Growth Link, which covers Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Burkina Faso, Togo, and so forth. JICA has been offering ODA loans and grants to construct infrastructure and support related socio-economic projects under these corridor development master plans. I'd like to emphasize that the formulating master plans, JICA supports capacity buildings of the recipient organizations in our technical cooperation framework. Well, our corridor development approach aims to connect infrastructure with regional economic development and integration. AUD and Nepad highly appreciate this initiative and takes it as a basic concept of the PDAP Act 2. Next slide, please. Infrastructure is not for building, but for delivering various useful services to the people, such as transport, electricity, water, communication, and so forth. With these services, infrastructure promotes socioeconomic development and supports people's livelihood. Our infrastructure support is not only to building hard infrastructure, but also to connecting them for regional integration and to using infrastructure as a foundation for economic development in an effective manner. Actually, Africa faces difficulties for debt sustainability as well as for public financing for building new infrastructure. How to use infrastructure more effectively, create regional connectivity, and promote economic development through soft infrastructure is now quite essential in Africa. Now, I'd like to suggest 5 points to advance soft infrastructure agenda and create connectivity strategies. First, infrastructure is to be designed to optimize its service delivery for users and to maximize its impact to socioeconomic development, like as under the corridor development framework. Second, transport infrastructure development is to be complemented with trade facilitation efforts in the regional and continental levels, such as one-stop border post. Third, it would be important to assist AfCFTA, African Continental Free Trade Area, with trade facilitation and regional infrastructure development. Fourth, it will also be important to utilize ICT technologies for maximizing the efficiencies of the project, such as border control management, quality control of the construction works, and maintenance. 5, lastly, JICA can share Asian experiences, especially ASEAN regional integration and connectivity, for which JICA has been working over the decades. As it is raised in this event, Africa needs soft infrastructure agenda more than ever, and JICA is ready to support with our experience and knowledge. This platform is a good framework in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Kato, for sharing this JICA model to kind of facilitate the advancing soft infrastructure agenda in Africa. So now you have had some, experience in some countries that you have seen in your presentation. So now we can move to Mr. Mikel from the EU perspective. just let's give us the lessons that can be shared from the EU perspective or experience to maximize infrastructure connectivity and how to implement it in economic corridor in Africa and PIDA 2 phases program. 10 minutes, Mr. Landabazo, please.
Mr. Gaviniki, thank you so much. We are delighted to be here. I'm here with my colleague Carlo, and I'm going to talk about the strategic corridors, also to respond to some extent to what Jose Luis from the World Bank was saying, how to define them. But before that, let me express my gratitude also to our colleagues in the OECD, dear colleagues, Annalisa, Luis, Federico, Mario. And let me tell you what is our role here. We are a scientific basis for defining these corridors. We are a research center of the European Commission. We have 3,000 people, 400 here in Seville, and we have a unit responsible for the work you're going to see in a minute. Let's start with the first slide, because you were talking about lessons, and to tell you the truth, we have learned more from our mistakes that have been done over a period of 30 years, trying to establish the trans-European networks. What are the trans-European networks? And maybe 3 lessons. The trans-European networks are the lifeblood of the single market. The single market is the source of prosperity, the basis for many things. Large middle classes, a stable democratic system, and this happens within a European Union of values, well beyond the narrow economic perspective. Now, what have we learned? First thing we have learned is that you need an African-wide, a European-wide, non-parochial, long-term perspective when you are designing transport, digital, energy corridors, infrastructures. You don't need anybody to come with money and distort your long-term goals. You have to stick to them. And you have to define them on the basis of solid scientific basis and out of a process of consensus and political discussion, open, transparent. The second thing is something that Jose Luis already said. Infrastructures, be it transport, energy, digital, once again, are a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. You build a big road, a highway to a less favored region in Europe, and all you do is to speed up migration to the most developed centers, cities, global cities, creating all sorts of problems and not solving the problem of underdevelopment. So any good policy in this field requires necessary as well as sufficient conditions. And I will share with you a paper when I finish that talks precisely on this. And what are these sufficient conditions? Well, entrepreneurship and innovation, if I had to define it in 2 words. And how do you do that? Well, we have developed a methodology in this research center that is being used in every single region in Europe and country, which is called Regional Innovation Strategies for a Smart Specialization, now on the road to sustainability. And the third lesson is also something that has been mentioned is non-tariff barriers. I just come from a meeting in which we were discussing how to set these industrial emissions for 52 large enterprises in Europe. You need to agree among yourselves about the standards. And this is linked to the process of economic integration, I suppose, of Africa, the same as it happened with us. So they both go hand in hand, the political process, the shared values, the shared vision about where and how to go and work together far. And I believe this is something coming from Africa. If you want to go far, go together. So next slide, please. Now to the subject, to the core of the whole thing. So the so-called strategic corridors. Why we don't, well, the European Union, our colleagues in INPA, I think it's called now, previously DEFCO, are going to be managing a lot of resources to help Africa as an equal partner, because we do know that our futures are connected and we are willing to deepen this relationship. And in that sense, because there is not money for everything, and because you need to set priorities and you need to characterize these strategic corridors, we're trying to define which are these corridors, on what basis, and what for. What for is very clear. Yeah, it is to improve connectivity, trade, sustainable development, safe connectivity, and also looking very carefully on value chains. And it was mentioned also by Jose Luis in this sense. So how do we spend our money, the limited amounts, your money, our money? How do we do a joint effort which is most productive? Well, by setting priorities, by establishing clear-cut criteria. Let's continue, please. So this is precisely what we are doing in our research center with Carlo. We have 8 criteria. This is how this holistic view, learning from our experience on the Thames, that we are looking at. 8 criteria: trade flows, value chains, very, very important. The interconnections, now in COVID times, you know, from just in time to just in case, as some economists have aptly put it. You know, how can we guarantee safe provision, not to stop, you know, final products because lack of suppliers? Foreign direct investment, digitalization, connectivity, logistics, sustainable mobility and biodiversity, cities, human development, peace and security. For us, the sustainable development goals, I have them on my wall behind me. They are a political priority of the European Union. We need to translate that in practice. How do we do this? You know, these are good aspirational criteria in many ways. Well, we go deep into this by identifying 100 indicators. And these indicators, you know, they come from the OECD, they come from local surveys from Africa, they come from the World Bank, from satellite data, from UN surveys. And we try to be as precise as possible to be able to define what corridors that benefit most broadly several nations, regions, those that make more sense in terms of 3 things: sustainability and the Green Deal, because that is the European fundamental priority based on its values: sustainability, fight against climate change. So how do we optimize the dimension of these green corridors? Human development, with an emphasis on equality. You know, Europe is characterized by this social market economy. Equality for us, I think, is an enlightenment value, is very, very strong in our policy making. No one left behind, an economy that works for all. And then jobs and growth of the future for the young generations, based on innovation and entrepreneurship, vocational training, all that. So human development is what corridors can link, you know, make sense in terms of schools, hospitals, valorizing the human capital, jobs and growth, looking at value chains. For example, let's next slide, please. My colleagues also in another site in Europe, here in the GRC, are looking at this Pan-African network of economic analysis with this Pan-African network on these agro-food systems. And we're trying to, well, as you see it now, help to enhance food and nutrition security. We are looking at value change. We want to help our African friends on this and have a joint diagnostic and define the opportunities with the right level of granularity and with the right level of research characterizing the options that we put forward, sound basis. Next slide, please, because I want to go very, very fast. So some brief conclusions, if you allow me, and they cannot be called conclusions, but one is this, as I say, an African white, a European white, a self-enlightened interest, if you want. You have to be selfish in an enlightened way. You have to, defend your objectives, but concentrate those that are win-win, with a long-term perspective, with an enlightened perspective. And this is how best to define the trans-African corridors, the strategic corridors. The intensification of our partnership can only happen when we have this clear, science-based, transparent way of defining common interests. Then, as I said, I'll try to explain very briefly, unfortunately, but I'll give you this paper. Connecting policies is as important as connecting places. You do not connect places unless you coordinate policies within a general strategy, and values and governance and institutions are essential. This is not about building brick and mortar. It's much more sophisticated. We need to look at governance and institutions. And this is why we came out with this idea of innovation strategies. And then finally, sustainable connectivity is absolutely essential because we are on this together. Climate change, the pandemic response is in joint endeavor. There is no solution for Europe or Africa without Europe or Africa finding also their solutions. So thank you so much. Sorry to be this quick. And back to you, Mr. Gavinki.
Thank you, Mr. Landabazo, for sharing the experience from the EU perspective. And we are really, really appreciated because this is exactly what we need to learn from, the EU experience. And I hope that indeed the clear and declared interest for all has already been agreed to intensify the partnership between EU and AU. Moving to next speaker, Mr. Geoffrey White, from now the private sector perspective. Can you just please tell us why software infrastructure matters so much for the private sector?
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. So hard and soft infrastructure, the reality is one won't work without the other. They have to work in harmony and develop together. And interestingly, from somebody who's been investing and building projects in Africa for the last 25 years, I think it's also important to acknowledge that there is an element of progress. There's still a huge infrastructure gap, but the reality is when you fly around Africa now, there's lots of new airports. When you ship into Africa, there's lots of new ports. And I would say from our perspective, we're investing in a network of international standard warehouses, so warehouse parks in all the main cities across the continent. But what's very clear is that I think the vast majority of countries are lagging behind on looking at soft infrastructure to keep it apace with the developments in hard infrastructure. So the roads are getting better, the ports are getting better, but the reality is the soft infrastructure that gels it all together is actually not improving as quickly as it should be, with a few exceptions like Rwanda and places. But the reality is that as a private sector company leasing warehousing to global companies and to SMEs, we see every day the frustrations that people have in how difficult it is to do business in Africa. So the challenges around it's more expensive to import anything or export anything in Africa. It's more expensive to move it around and cross the borders with it. It takes longer than it does in other markets. So for Africa to start becoming more efficient, it's really a question of focusing on, to attract the private sector, focusing on reducing the cost and the time and understanding the movement of goods across the continent. So if you look, the private sector understands the growth opportunity, understands the demographics of Africa, the opportunity of the continental free trade zone. They understand the urbanization that's going on and the potential opportunity. They're just reticent to invest because of the time and cost of actually doing business across the continent. So I think those are the issues that need to be addressed. And some examples, I mean, it takes 26 stops to move a truck from across West Africa. If I'm moving a truck from Senegal to Lagos, it gets stopped 26 times. The colleague in Rwanda mentioned it takes 15 days to deliver a container from Mombasa to Kigali. The reality is that's 1,500 kilometers. So that means your truck is doing 100 kilometers a day. Well, that's horrific by world standards in relation to efficiency. So the soft infrastructure issue is absolutely essential for Africa to be able to start competing. And as we all know, Africa currently imports 90% of everything it consumes. If you want it to become, and it should become, a manufacturing center for itself firstly, and then for export secondly, it needs to solve the issues around single window clearance at customs, cross-border movements, the paperwork, the cost, and the time of actually doing business in Africa. We have numerous companies that come to us saying, we want to set up an African distribution center, either in West Africa or in East Africa. Then they look at the cost of, the integrated cost of shipping a container, moving it through customs, clearing the port, the cost of road transport, the cost of loading and unloading. If you want to go regionally, the cost of crossing borders, and they end up coming to the conclusion that actually we'll just ship out of Dubai or Rotterdam or Amsterdam or Singapore rather than create a presence on the continent. So I think the opportunity is clear. There's a huge number of private sector investors and SMEs that want to grow across the continent, but the cost of doing business has to be reduced and has to be brought in alignment with other markets. So the first step is actually just creating an environment where you can operate regionally. So a manufacturer in Ghana is able to move goods to Togo, to Nigeria, to Cote d'Ivoire, and to Senegal, and up to Burkina Faso with ease and simplicity. The second aspect is, once you do that, companies start to actually want to be based in Africa. They then start to expand and grow, because rather than just servicing the Ghanaian market, they start to service a West African market and eventually an African market. And as that scale comes and develops, I think you'll be able to get into a position where we can start to compete on a global perspective. Currently, because of the cost of power, the cost of moving goods in and out of the country, it's very difficult for African manufacturers to be competitive. So there's really a win-win for everybody by focusing on the soft infrastructure element of how much does it cost to take a 40-foot container into the country or out of the country, getting those down to global norms, and then Africa can start to compete, not just on a regional basis to stop imports, but on a global basis to actually compete as a manufacturing global hub. Sorry, 5 minutes is short.
Yeah, thank you so very much, Mr. White, for this, private sector perspective on, looking at the importance of the critical role of the soft infrastructure that may also play in the implementation of this, even the CFTA in this context of COVID and moving merchandise, movement of people. We must have this really take into account the importance of this soft infrastructure. Thank you so very much. And now let's move to the second round of questions. And as I've said from the beginning, please let's stick to the minutes of the limited minutes of intervention. Let's say 3 minutes now, because we are also getting kind of red light from interpreters. So let's stick to 3 minutes intervention. Back to Mr. Jose Luis. Now, following your previous presentation, what can we learn from the experience of your region addressing this issue of soft and hard infrastructure? And what do you think should be the priority for African countries in these related issues? Mr. Luis, please. Yeah, please unmute your microphone.
Okay, thank you very much. Critical, as it has mentioned, is the selection, identification of the corridors, the criteria and priorities, because we don't have the money, the capacity to do everything that we want to do. It's critical. And for that, you need to have a taking stock. What is the production of the goods as well as the people that need to be moved? Critical. But again, on the softness side, again, a lot needs to be done. And what it helps is somehow identify critical products and follow them through from production to the market. And from that, you will identify what we have done, again, in Latin America, specifically a number of countries and elsewhere, is to go through this step by step. When you need, and what we did have, is the collection of silos with cooling capacity, packaging capacity, and mobility units that pick up, consolidate, and somehow package them and bring them to the market. Second thing is really the transport issue. I mean, the typology of tracking that will bring the products to the market in an effective time and with maintaining the quality of the products. That is where the cooling capacity is critical. Then the regulatory elements in terms of the licensing, certification, inspections, the ports and the border crossing that will reduce times. I mean, the times and the quality are critical. I mean, all my evaluations indicate really logistic costs, which are in the range of between 20 and 30% of product value. And that is an aberration. And you can bring them down to basically on the teens, if you focus one by one on these elements on the soft side, that institutionality and the capacity and the knowledge, and that one. Transfer knowledge in the production side, transfer knowledge on the moving, consolidation, the packaging and transportation. If you do those things, your logistic costs will drop significantly. You have limited capacity, you have limited financing, so be smart on prioritizing the type of products, the type of corridors, and the types of soft infrastructure elements which are critical somehow to reduce the cost of moving goods across the country. Happy to, I do have a platform on the sub side. I'll be happy to share, again, whoever is interested, because we did implement that very successfully in a number of countries in Latin America. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Luis. I hope our colleagues from out the Nepad are taking good note of those, kind of recommendations and advice. Let's now move this second round to Mr. Kato. You have already highlighted it in your presentation, the role of this, how do you call the Asian model. So we just want you to give more insight in what is the possible contributions of JICA that could bring into the African continent, including sharing Asian experience and also enhancing the efficiency and effectiveness in the delivery of infrastructure services, in particular economic corridor projects in Africa. If you really can give more insight on what JICA can bring to Africa, will be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Chanduni. Let me raise 4 points to give quick answers to your question. First, concerning corridor development, please show the slide. I have mentioned before, JICA has completed master plans of corridor development aligning with PDAPAT 1 and providing financial and technical support to realize it. We can continue similar contribution aligning with PDAPAT 2, which is now on the finalization stage. And also, JICA can provide corridor development experience and lessons from Asia. Mekong region's corridor development is a successful case to build cross-border infrastructure network for enhancement of connectivity and cross-border economic region with the establishment of ASEAN Economic Community, AEC. The second, in the field level, OSPP could be a good model with support from JICA. This is a complex of hard infrastructure and soft components, such as simplifying border control procedures, building information system, enhancing capacity of border officials, coordinating government policies and institutions. OSPP is an indispensable component of cross-border infrastructure and regional integration. To make OSPP work effectively, soft infrastructure is essential. OSPP is quite complicated but can bring a lot of economic benefits with a minimum financial cost. In this regard, JICA has been continuously working with regional economic communities, RECs, for standardizing border control management and providing opportunities for training and knowledge sharing. The source book, which we called, is one of the outcomes from cooperation with EAC, East African Community, whose experiences are already shared with the other RECs. Third, to promote FTA, African Continental FTA, trade facilitation and logistics network are both essential to maximize its potential and to bring economic benefits for African countries. In this context, next. Thank you. In this context, ASEAN can be a very useful model example for Africa. ASEAN becomes growth center of the world with fragmented manufacturing network through strengthened connectivity and evolving free trade framework. ASEAN Free Trade Area, AFTA, established in 1992, has achieved its target and was expanded as ASEAN Trade in Goods and Agreement, ATIGA, in 2010, then was finally integrated as ASEAN's Economic Community, AEC, in 2015. ASEAN is a different type of regional integration from Union European. It doesn't have any unified political institutions, but it is working as a very unified and competitive economic region with highly developed regional supply chains. Now it is an important part of global supply chain, like as EU and NAFTA. ASEAN's GDP becomes double in 10 years and 100 times more in 15 years. JICA is preparing to offer opportunities for African Continental FTA related authorities to share ASEAN's Asian experiences and achievements. And next, please. Next slide, please. Lastly, G20 principle on quality infrastructure investment is useful reference framework for hard infrastructure as well as for soft infrastructure. It would be important to understand these principles, not on the paper, but on the ground with good practices. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Jaiko, for this additional inputs that gives us a clear indication on how and what could be done by JICA, and also the experience sharing with what's going on in the area of investment and productive transformation in Asia that could be benchmarked by African countries. So now let's move to last but not least, Mr. White. Back to you. Looking at this platform, what do you think, Mr. White, this platform could usefully do to help advance improvement in the soft infrastructure agenda?
So I think the perception of doing business in Africa remains incredibly difficult and challenging. When we speak to international companies that aren't in Africa, they're still reticent to go. They sort of understand the market opportunity, but they don't want to engage. So I think it's a question of just bringing transparency and ease of doing business to those companies. And something that I think the platform could do that would be useful, not just for foreign direct investment, but also for SME sector and also for governments mainly, is to actually put together an index that states how much it is to move a container into each of the individual countries in Africa and on these trade corridors, so that people can understand transparently the cost related to moving. And I think that what that could potentially do is create a more competitive environment where Ghana is saying, okay, we need to be more efficient, we need to reduce our port costs, which they just did very successfully. We need to be more aggressive in the market to bring down the cost of logistics so as we can compete with Togo or with Apapa or with Dakar, etc. So I think if we can bring some transparency into the cost of doing business in each of the individual main corridors, then you start to create for a government a competitive environment where they're saying, we want the Mombasa corridor to be more efficient and less expensive than the Nacala corridor, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if you bring transparency to those costs, that will have the impact of actually on the ground focusing people's attention, governments and the private sector's attention on how do you reduce those costs to make each individual solution more attractive.
Yeah, thank you for that input from the private sector perspective. Indeed, in advancing infrastructure agenda in Africa, what could this platform do? We thank you for that. And now, let me just first, we have done with the second round of questions, just to thank all the panelists for their input, for their contribution. We really advise all of those who were involved in this panel to have maybe bilateral discussions, because we have learned a lot from the Latin American perspective, from the Asian perspective, as well as from the EU perspective and the private sector perspective. I think discussions on this issue must continue between different stakeholders. So now on the agenda, we have question to be answered by panelists and to be kicked off by Mr. Sebastien Frendo. Is he connected, or we move to invite Mr. From the African Union Commission, if Mr. Moses Banyanga is connected? Or if not, so then we can then invite Mrs. Simi Shiwisa, the head of public policy ABSA, to provide her perspective on this subject. The quick one.
Thank you, Chairperson, and I'd like to thank both the OECD Development Center as well as the African Union Commission for convening this dialogue. And I think the strength of the conversations is the ability of both organizations to bring in not only global voices, but also African countries and representatives of the private sector. ABSA is one of the leading African banks and one of the leading investors on the continent. We definitely have benefited from the interventions over the past 2 days. I just want to start off by saying the issue of investment climate and improving investment climate is really essential for private investment. All African investors and other investors coming in are committed to increasing their investments. However, there are basic building blocks that must be met. I just want to expand further, and I know people like Jeffrey and others have spoken about investment climate issues. For example, if we are to maximize benefits from regional integration, we've got to have regulatory convergence. If you are integrating 54 countries with 54 standards, policies, and laws, it would be very, very difficult. Secondly is how you harmonize policies and what is the sequencing for such harmonization. The third important point would obviously be taxation issues. All our countries are facing significant fiscal pressures. And unless we can have a clear tax regime that works, that is predictable to the outside world, we might have some challenges in the future. The issues of rule of law, the speaker from Rwanda spoke very well on this. It is very important that we have predictability around one, licenses, as well as the overall climate for doing business. Chairperson, the elephant in the room here is funding and how we fund Africa's development. The speaker from Japan spoke briefly about the debt situation, and I think this question remains unresolved. And I think there are three key points that we would want to raise here. One, what credit enhancement instruments could be used to encourage further private sector investment on the African continent? We are all aware that COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated fiscal pressures on all governments across the continent. The IMF estimated that $1.2 trillion, I beg your pardon, would be required by African countries in the next 3 years to allow themselves to recover. Now, that is a substantial amount of money. And unless we can have an open conversation around how we finance Africa's development, given the new context, we might not meet our objectives. So I'd like to pose that question. The second question is around financing transition. The speaker from the EU spoke very well around the need for green transition. And again, Africa remains at risk to climate change related risks, and there has to be funding for that. But it has a cost. And African countries and investors like ourselves on the continent, we are willing to put our balance sheets on the line. But even if all African investors came together, the funding would simply not be enough. And how can we work with international partners using platforms like the one today to actually have a clear conversation on this and develop working solutions? Because ultimately, unless someone can pay for all the costs and we can have fair risk sharing, we will remain having conceptual debates about what needs to be done. Chairperson, thank you very much. That's all we will say today.
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Simi. I think we can go back to Mr. Moises if he's connected for 3 minutes. The quick one, just to highlight on the continental, the AUC, the African Union Continental Digital Transformation Strategy 2020-2030. If he's connected, could he please take the floor so that you just can share the experience of the African Union Commission? Please, Moises.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll be quick. I've just concluded another meeting. Yes, I hope you can hear me, Chair.
Sure, we can hear you clearly.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I will quickly just try to highlight how the digital transformation strategy for Africa will help improve its regional connectivity. My name is Moses Baingana. I'm acting head of the Information Society Division at the African Union Commission. Now, Africa's digital transformation strategy for the next decade was adopted by the AU Summit in February 20, with the overall objective to harness digital technologies and innovation to transform Africa's societies and the economies. Digital infrastructure is a foundation pillar of the strategy. And of course, the launch of the African Continental Free Trade Area, for it to be achieved would require further improvements in digital connectivity. So how does this strategy, digital transformation strategy for Africa, help improve this regional connectivity? First, one of the objectives of the digital transformation strategy for Africa is to create an environment necessary to guarantee investment and financing in order to close the digital infrastructure gap and achieve an accessible, affordable, secure broadband across demography, gender, and geography. Policies for promoting digital infrastructure based on market competition, private sector investment, and independent regulation have been effective to some extent. However, we have also seen open markets underperform. For instance, the private sector underinvests if the private return on an investment is less than the social return. In the digital domain, this happens in remote areas and unattractive markets. The costs of reaching them are high in relation to the commercial return, as they live mainly in rural locations with low population density or low purchasing power. But the social costs of remaining unserved are high and growing. Therefore, government policies can encourage the provision of last mile connectivity by permitting competing facilities. So the digital transformation strategy is recommending policies to ensure that the digital infrastructure is promoted and regional connectivity is improved. Secondly, the implementation of the strategy will also lead to the establishment of localized infrastructure through data centers and IXPs to save costs on international connectivity, reduce latency, to ensure better connectivity performance, and improve Africa's regional connectivity. The situation now is that currently, submarine cables bring the necessary international connectivity to coastal areas, and some non-coastal countries are making remarkable efforts to connect their territory through terrestrial network infrastructures. But this is only the first step of the digital infrastructure. Currently, a very large part of the IT content consumed in Africa comes from outside. The strategy will lead to establishment of more data centers and IXPs as the digital infrastructure that will complement the international connectivity to ensure improvement of Africa's regional connectivity. Thirdly, the strategy also calls for the development of digital platforms to serve people, businesses, and government agencies in all aspects of life, including healthcare, education, commerce, and public benefits. Digital platforms are an essential element of digital infrastructure and can serve people, businesses, and government agencies in all aspects of life. They also serve and enable other products or services. For businesses, digital platforms are also an efficient mechanism to help firms, especially SMEs, expand access to markets, exchange goods and services, and tap into underutilized assets and human resources, which potentially leads to more and better jobs in the economy. In summary and in conclusion, the digital transformation strategy for Africa proposes development of policies and establishment of physical and soft digital connectivity infrastructure to improve regional digital connectivity and contribute to the achievement of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, my brother Moses, for that contribution, and we really highly appreciate. Now let me just, express our appreciation to all panelists and participants to these two panels that from which we have learned a lot. And of course, we have taken good note for the contribution, and we'll make sure that the proper follow-up be made on the regarding the what has been discussed here. And we also want to express our again appreciation to interpreters who have accompanied us during these two panels. And then let me give the floor to Federico Bonaglia, the Deputy Director of the OECD Development Center, for his closing remark. I really appreciate and thank you so very much.
Merci beaucoup, Jean-Denis. Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to being with you throughout these 2 days, and we have learned a lot, I would say. I will not try to summarize everything that we have learned, because as I said, it's a lot, but I will just maybe share with you 3 takeaways that I will summarize with 3 letters: S, L, I. S like strategy, L like learning, and I like implementation. And then I will conclude with some next steps about where we would like to go from today to the next step. So why strategy? I think that we have heard from all of you that the question of infrastructure and connectivity cannot be taken in isolation from the overall development strategy of a country or of a continent. And that it's not only about building roads, energy, ports, but is to connect, as Michael said, connect policies as much connecting people and connecting places. And so it's very important that a government of a regional or a continental institution invests in developing a clear strategy for infrastructure and connectivity, which is related to, as we heard yesterday and the day before yesterday in the forum, to the imperative of productive transformation and job creation. This is, I think, something that we will retain. But when we talk about strategy, we also talk about policies, priorities, and the coherence across the two. And I think that although we have spoken a lot today about the importance of involving the private sector, which is of course fundamental, as it is fundamental to engage and involve local communities, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who are going to bear the costs or the benefits of infrastructure, and not only in the short term. We also heard throughout the 2 days the fundamental role of the government and the state. In particular, this was exposed even more in the response to the pandemic. And so I think that we should not go into this discussion with a kind of Manichaean approach where we say, is the private sector or is the public sector? It's clearly a partnership between the two. And we know that unfortunately, the investment from the private sector into infrastructure is quite limited. There is a recent paper by Marianne Fay that shows why this is the case. And I think that, again, it's not a matter of going with one or the other, it's going together. But we also know, and Jose Luis has been a maestro in this, in teaching us about this, that public-private partnerships are not the magic bullet, and that there are a number of conditions that need to be in place if we want those partnerships to work. And we know that more than 30% of projects in Latin America have been renegotiated, more than 50% when it comes to roads, and in more than 60% of the cases, the renegotiation led to the private sector to see the conditions improve and not to the private sector, and not to the public sector. So I think that the experience of Rwanda is clear. You need to have political leadership, you need to have priority in place, you need to invest in capacity. And this, I go to my last point of the strategy, which is the coherence. You also need to do it in a way which is coherent with the overall strategy of the country. This brings me to my second point, which is about learning. As we heard from Rwanda, you should not wait to have everything in place before you start to do things. You need to do it, as they say in French, au fur et à mesure. So you need to do as you go. And in this respect, I think that the project and the recommendation that came out from our joint work with ASSET are very important in this respect, because they point to some very, very concrete steps in terms of building community of practices, practitioners in Africa that can engage in exactly this type of technical work in helping the public and the private sector make projects bankable and sustainable, but also with a development impact. I think that learning is not only learning within a country, it's also learning across regions. And I think that here we were very privileged to have three excellent experiences shown. Asia with Mr. Kato. Thank you very much, Mr. Kato. We had Latin America, but not only, from Jose Luis Guash, and we have, of course, Europe and beyond with Mikel Landabaso. And I think that this is the reason why this partnership between the Development Center and the African Union Commission is so important, because there is a lot that we can learn from outside Africa, and there is a lot that we can learn from within Africa. And it's important that we bring together these two aspects of learning. Let me go to my third point, the I, which is implementation. I think that as we learn from CIMI and from others during today, but also yesterday, we can have in place the best strategies and plans, hopefully not Napoleonic, as Jose Luis said. But in the end, the crux of the matter is implementation. And so we need to move forward with supporting what exists and what is proven to work. And I think here we heard about the PIDA, Phase 2, the extraordinary work that AUDA is doing, the support that the European Union, that Japan, that many interlocutors are providing to Africa. So let's build on what is working and let's implement it. I will conclude here with just a couple of points about where are we going from today to the next. As you heard yesterday, this platform is the result of a joint effort between the OECD Development Center and the African Union, but it doesn't want to be a platform of the two organizations. This wants to be a place where we can connect different initiatives and different people. And through a process of consultation that my friend Luis Padilla has led, and Jean-Denis Gabichini and Dosina Yeo and many friends and colleagues, we have now identified a number of topics. And the 2 days that we spent together allow us to narrow down and identify some priorities for action. So we discussed about human capital. We discussed today about soft and hard infrastructure. We will be discussing at the next meeting about continental integration. And I see here my colleague Annalisa Primi. And of course, we will take advantage of the policy dialogue initiative that involves many African countries already about global value chains and productive transformation. So we will make the best of what you share with us. We will produce some conclusions out of this meeting, and we will use them to implement, which means to continue in our joint effort to make sure that we can mobilize more resources for sustainable development and productive transformation in Africa. I would like to conclude now with a big word of thanks. I will start by the interpreters. They've been extraordinary. Apologies if we spilled over a little bit. Bear with us. I hope that you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. I would like to thank our brothers in the African Union, Jean-Denis, Yeo, and all the others that have worked with us. I would like to thank my colleagues, Luis, Arthur, Bakary, Annalisa, Julia, Keiko, Mariana, Hiza, and all the others. My colleague Ayumi, who is the Deputy Director as well at the Development Center in charge of infrastructure, and Yumika, who is behind the scene but has also contributed a lot to this work. A big word of thanks. I hope that you don't forget anyone. If that's the case, apologies. And till the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.